Hello, this is Dr. John Wineland once again, coming to you with another presentation on restoration history. This one's entitled Organizational Development. These are the changes that take place over the years, and decisions have to be made as to how, why, and I suppose in some cases if, there should be more organization. So let's take a look then at organizational development. Organizational development. Okay. If we go all the way back here to the Brush Run Church, this is a photo of the Brush Run Church, and didn't need a whole lot of organizational development at that point because they had just one congregation, just 40 people. That way is pretty easy to keep track of and run. But as things begin to grow, then we're going to see there are new challenges. So early on, there was a real focus on the local autonomy. Each congregation would choose their leaders. Each congregation would choose their minister, their preacher. Each congregation would take up a collection, and then they would decide what happened to those monies and resources that they had. And there was a real opposition to hierarchy, because they'd come out of the Presbyterian Church with its presbyteries and synods, and there were assemblies and sessions, and there's also all kinds of names for church organization. They were opposed to this because they saw how it had kind of oppressed the local congregations and how it often had created situations which were really not very useful. And so the Brush Run Church, we could call it an independent congregation. And then we'll see, of course, they do merge in the beginning with the Baptist groups, the Redstone Baptist Association, of course, the Mahoning Baptist Association. Once they were kind of asked to leave the Redstone Baptist Association, and then the Mahoning Baptist Association disbands and those congregations come in, they're starting to add more and more congregations. But yet, everything is still being run pretty much the way it had been from the beginning with the Brush Run Church. So there will be a little change in attitude, I guess I would say, as they begin to get more and more congregations, and there are more and more questions about how they might best work together, how they might do things. At first, the leaders were very busy defending themselves, and they were so busy defending themselves, they didn't really have much time to think about how all this was going to work together as we grow from, say, one congregation to 10, to 30, to 100. There's the merger with the Stone movement. So now you have hundreds of congregations, and how do we organize that? So part of it was going to see they're going to wonder about cooperation with each other. There was a lot of repetitive activity. And so the idea was if we could bring those things together, we might be much more efficient. Much more efficient in evangelism, in missions, in publications, etc. So they were concerned about fellowship, of course. How do we organize that? But spreading the gospel and spreading the knowledge of the Bible. Well, in 1842, Alexander Campbell, abbreviated here AC, in his Millennial Harbinger, you see a picture the cover of one of these, Millennial Harbinger, devoted to primitive Christianity. Remember, it's the Millennial Harbinger. This is something we haven't really talked about, but Alexander Campbell and his millennial views, if you know millennial views, they're very popular today, is premillennial view, maybe an amillennial view. But Alexander Campbell was actually a post-millennialist. And he believed that Christ would come when the church had evangelized the world enough that the world got better and better, and then Christ would come. This is a post-millennial view. So his journal is called the Millennial Harbinger. Harbinger is something that's calling your attention to the millennium. And so he is trying to call your attention to the coming of Christ and to how the world must keep being evangelized, keep improving, so that we can see the coming of the millennium. Well, he calls for some organization in his journal, where this is going to first sort of take root is in missions. Okay, if you start thinking about it, if you have, let's say there's 500 church congregations, 500 congregations, and you want to try to evangelize different parts of the world. Let's say Africa. Now, how is that going to be done? None of these congregations had the finances and probably the personnel to send a missionary to somewhere in Africa and fund them and recruit, train, and fund a missionary, let alone several missionaries. However, if we put together the 500 congregations, pool the money, the resources, and so forth, perhaps we could evangelize much better a place like Africa or the Caribbean, or even in parts of the United States. So we see then a cooperative meeting is called. And this comes as a result of Alexander Campbell, who publishes in the Millennial Harbinger a series of 7 articles which he entitles The Cooperation of Churches. This is from 1832 or 1831 to 1832. He believed that the world would never be evangelized unless churches cooperated in some way. And these 7 articles that he wrote was pleading for cooperation, but interestingly, not organization. We need to cooperate without creating some organization to do it. That is, these congregations need to work with one another without some other organization doing it. So at this point, Alexander Campbell is opposed, I guess you would say, to a overarching missions organization that these congregations would support. But he did think those congregations should come together and support missions. So this proves to be difficult, proves to be easier said than done. So some disagreed with any kind of cooperation. They're fiercely independent, and they didn't like this idea. They said it's going to lead to organization, and then we're going to have people who are going to call themselves president of it, or treasurer, or secretary, or officers, or something. Those people are going to assume authority then over congregations, and then that's just the next step to the local autonomy being diminished or lost. Well, we'll see then that Alexander had to make his arguments for church organization? Well, one of the arguments for church organization was we need to get the Bible in the hands of the people. And of course, at this time, books were still pretty expensive, often hard to come by. And so that meant that not every person and not even every home had a Bible. If we're going to print up Bibles, how are we going to be able to do that? Let's say a congregation of 50 to 100 people want to print up Bibles to distribute, let's say in their town, in their county, or their area. It's quite expensive to do printing at this time. And if you said, okay, let's print up 500 Bibles, it would be quite expensive to do that. If, however, 500 congregations went together and said, we need 5,000 Bibles, you could print those Bibles up a lot cheaper. Because once the, at that time you're using a printing press, once the printing press is set up and all the type is set, running extra copies really costs very little. So the cost per Bible, per volume, goes way down the more you print. So obviously if we could bring a lot of congregations together, we all print a large number together, the overall price would be less and more people would receive a copy of the Bible. Okay? So that's one argument that we should organize in some way. Another, of course, is with missions. Again, it's pretty daunting to find or recruit people who are missionaries and to get them trained so that they actually know what they're doing when they get on the mission field. And so in the end, then, if we could come together, let's say 500 congregations, and pool our money, our resources, our contacts, and so forth, we could recruit many more missionaries, fund them, and have them start to do good work wherever they're sent. Another would be the improvement of ministry. And this could be ministry of a wide variety of ways. For example, helping the young people, the children, helping orphans, training, creating schools for elementary or all the way up through high school, because a lot of education wasn't free, a lot of it wasn't readily available. Perhaps we could do that education and include in it studies about Christ, studies about the Bible, that sort of thing. So we could improve our ministry if we just had more resources. If we pool together 500 congregations, we'd have a lot more resources than if we're going alone on this. Another argument for organization would be to protect congregations from irresponsible preachers. We don't like to talk about it, think about it, but there are individuals who take advantage of their situation. They are irresponsible. Sometimes they even do things that are illegal or immoral. And since the congregations are so independent, they often don't hear about it. I mean, this even happens still, unfortunately, it still happens today. And our churches are very decentralized. We have no central authority. We have no vetting process for ministers, for ordination and things like that. You're ordained by your home congregation. They endorse you. You are ordained in that way. And so then when you go to a congregation to preach, they are relying upon whoever did that. You know, I can tell you, I've preached at several churches over the years. I don't think I've ever had one of them asked to see an ordination certificate. I don't know if any of them ever checked on me, other than, you know, maybe a little bit. Oh, yeah, you know this guy, yeah, he's okay. But what I'm saying is that if you had a person who got into trouble or did something wrong, let's say in Kentucky. They might get in their car and go to Ohio or go to Florida or go to Missouri, end up working at a church there, and maybe do the same kinds of things. Now, if we had some organization where we'd say have a list of ministers or have a list at least of irresponsible preachers, then a congregation could contact and say, okay, what do you know about this person? Are they okay? Okay, so this is, and by the way, this is still a concern today. We are still today, the Christian churches, Churches of Christ, quite decentralized. And I suppose there's more communication today, things on the internet and that sort of thing, but still, it is a potential problem. Well, what else? Well, if you think about the total resources of the church, we talk about 500 congregations, how much resources are there? And if we don't have to duplicate all of these resources, it would be far more efficient. I used to use an example, since you are taking a college class, right, that we have still, even though we've had several colleges which have recently closed, we still have a whole lot of colleges. So if you think about that, I don't know how many we have. I didn't go out and count them, but we certainly have, let's say, 10 to 15, easily. And is that efficient to have, say, 15 different colleges? What does that mean? That means you have 15 different presidents. You have 15 academic deans. You have 15 libraries. You have 15 campuses. You have 15 basketball teams, therefore 15 coaches at least, probably more than that. So you think about the libraries, the facilities like gyms. How many? 15 gyms, 15, at least 15 dormitories or 15 sets of dormitories, 15 campuses, 15 classroom buildings at least. So if you think about that, it'd be far more efficient, since many of our colleges are rather small. A lot of them are, some are under 100, some are, several are under 200. I don't know if we have very many that are, over 500 or 600. So, I would say most all of them are less than 1,000, definitely, and some much longer. If we took all the students at all the colleges and we put them on one campus, how many students would we have? Well, I don't know. But let's say we would have 3,000. Let's say we'll have 5,000. We'll be generous. If we had 5,000 students on one campus, imagine the efficiency of that, as far as you would only need one administration instead of 15. You wouldn't need 15 sets of faculty. You would have one set of faculty members and staff, and you could do things on a bigger scale. You could have more sports. You could have more books. You could have more resources, more buildings, and so on and so forth, and a lot more efficient use. Now, don't worry. That's not going to happen. I don't have the power to do that, and no one has the power to do that. The only thing that really would keep a college going or cause it to end, it all comes down really to finances. It doesn't come down to some authority, some denominational headquarters say, hey, we got too many colleges. We're going to go from 15 down to 3. And so we're going to pick the 3 most viable. The others are going to close and merge or whatever, and be far more efficient. That's not going to happen because we don't have that kind of organization. Now, some people say that's great. On the other hand, if you want to create a situation where people can be trained and have an education, you could do that. You could start your own college. What would you need to do? Have enough money, have enough people, have enough students. You could start a college. Okay, you could start your own college and name it after yourself, I guess, or whatever. And that could happen. Now, given the logistics, the finances, everything else, again, that's unlikely to happen, but it could. In the same way, the total use of church resources in all these areas of missions, of education, if you think of Christian camps, or what they're called Christian service camps, think of any of these kinds of things. Orphanages, you think about collecting food and money and so forth for poor families. Just think of what could be done. Well, the best use of resources then, if we pool it together. Now, what people say is, hey, look at the Bible. We have an example of congregations coming together. We see it in the New Testament, don't we? Paul collects money, collects resources from various churches, especially we know in Greece and so forth. And then he takes that money, those resources, and takes them to Jerusalem to deliver them to the churches there, to help them because they were having a bad time. So we could work together to raise funds. We could work together to do various things. So this is how it gets started. Of course, there's a lot of fear there. The fear is who's going to control this and what's going to stop this from being something that'll get out of hand and start to try to take control of everything. Well, the very first organization then, I guess we could say, is the Bible Society in 1845. It was called the American Christian Bible Society. Starts in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's led by the man pictured here, D.S. Burnett, Cincinnati, a wealthy man who lived in Cincinnati, came from a prominent family. The idea here was we would all come together and we would distribute the sacred scriptures, as they called it, throughout the world. We could bring it together. We could do a mass printing of Bibles, and those could be distributed. And so, in the constitution of this organization, since it is an organization, they have a constitution. This constitution calls for officers, an annual meeting, and auxiliary societies. Burnett, then, is the president of this society, and he said this is a holy cause and it should enlist all our affections. We need to do this. We need to be behind it for evangelism and to help save the lost. Okay, so this is our first organization. After that, we're going to see, of course, that American Christian Bible Society, but others will come. That's in Cincinnati in 1845, distribute Bibles. And they weren't going to put any comments in the Bible. It was just going to be an English version, no doubt the King James. And it's not going to have any notes, any comments, anything in it other than this is just a Bible. We've printed it up, and we're going to hand them out to you. Now, of course, while you're kind of in the business of printing, well, it kind of makes sense to begin to explore the American Christian Publishing Society, which would handle publishing things besides just Bibles. These could be commentaries or other things to help people study the Bible. And they could be printed up, pamphlets and books and so forth. That starts at the same time in Cincinnati in 1845. And the idea here is it would become the publishing house, the place where things were published for the entire group of churches. Well, it fails at its attempt to become a publishing house. This met with a lot of suspicion, I think because it was mostly just centered in Cincinnati, and they didn't really talk to a lot of other people. I think this also kind of hurt it. The Missionary Society, we're going to talk about it, but first let's just mention the Bible Society got support from most periodicals. Alexander Campbell opposed it in his Millennial Harbinger. And of course that had a lot of weight, a lot of influence with people. Why? Why would he oppose such a thing? He said it was organized by just a few in Cincinnati rather than by a general convention of congregations. So some have speculated if somebody had come up with this idea and started it up in Bethany, where he was, then he would not have opposed it. But this creates much controversy among the periodicals. Many condemned it. Many didn't think it was a good idea. And so we see this is the first foray into this kind of organization. Now, Campbell was friends with Burnet. They remained friends, but Campbell, nevertheless, continued to oppose this organization. Well, as we continue to look at different societies, we need to begin to look at the missionary society, what's called the American Christian Missionary Society. Here is a picture of the acting managers, board of managers of it early on. And we see it begins in 1849 in Cincinnati. Eventually it will take into account 11 different states, 100 different congregations, and 156 delegates. It was organized to have quarterly meetings, 4 times a year, and an annual state meeting. So that means there would be a state meeting in 11 states, and there would be quarterly meetings as well, and 156 delegates. All right. The delegates were based upon the giving of the congregation. If a congregation made donation to the organization, then they could send a delegate to sort of oversee what happened to the money. Now, this organization sends out its first missionary. They actually sent out a missionary. The very first one is named James Barclay. James Barclay is sent to Jerusalem in 1851. It may seem like a strange place to start. Why Jerusalem? Well, they were trying to follow the Bible, they would say. If you take a look in the book of Acts, it says, go to the Great Commission, go to Jerusalem, right? Samaria, the uttermost parts of the world. So they decided, since the Bible mentions evangelizing in Jerusalem, that they better start there. So that's what they do. James Barclay goes there at that time. Well, Campbell doesn't really oppose this because he sees that it might well be an efficient way to do missions, and how will we ever reach the world if we're not organized? So this is in 1849, a more efficient organization. But it raises some questions. How could independent churches come together and hold some kind of convention or meetings like this? I mean, who's going to call it? Who's going to run it? Where is it going to be held? And importantly, who will accept it? Will all the congregations accept this? And so these are the issues that we see as organization comes. Now, this next screen shows us just a list of people who were officers appointed and nominated to various officers. And take a look. Alexander Campbell, Bethany, Virginia, president. Right? And there's Dr. James Barclay. He is listed as a delegate. And so we can see it has some large backing. Well, Barclay goes off. By the way, Barclay is related to Alexander Campbell by marriage. I believe Barclay is married to one of Alexander's daughters. He had several daughters, by the way. And so this first work, Dr. James T. Barclay, Scottsville, Virginia, to Jerusalem. They arrive in Jerusalem in 1850. 1850. Shortly thereafter, they will send other missionaries. Alexander Cross, who was a freed slave, is said to Liberia. And if you know anything about Liberia, I don't know if you do or not, Liberia is a country in Africa along the coast, along the west coast, that was established during the time of President Monroe to be a place where freed slaves could go. The idea was we should free the slaves and we should send them back to Africa, literally, actually. And so they created a country that would be just for liberated slaves from the United States. It's called Liberia, for liberty and freedom. And its capital is Monrovia, named after President Monroe. We also see J.O. Beardsley goes to Jamaica very early on here, about the same time. So we see this work going. Now, as you might imagine, this created a stir in some. Some rejected it, some did not like it at all. And for about 10 years, there were many who opposed it. And some opposed it quite vigorously. This organization never had complete support. One of the early and outspoken critics of this is Jacob Kreeft Jr., pictured here. And what some people are going to do, and Kreeft is going to do, he's going to say, well, you know what? Even Alexander Campbell, who's now, I guess, the president, he supports it, was not for this early on. Why has he changed? It was sort of a criticism of Campbell as well, where they quote Campbell back to himself. Have you ever had somebody do that? I've had it happen to me a couple times. You'll say something like, well, you know, at some point you'll say, well, this should never happen, or this should be like this. And then something happens and you're supporting or doing something in a different way, and then somebody comes back and said, well, why are you doing this? You told us that it should be this way, and it should never be like that, and now you're doing it. And that's really kind of what they're doing to Campbell here. Campbell said the New Testament churches were not fractured into missionary societies. And he also said the New Testament church knew nothing of the hobbies of modern times. So they're trying to use Campbell's words against the group which Campbell actually supports. Well, the Christian Missionary Society will form in 1859. Why did this form in Indianapolis in 1859? This society forms at this time because they are opposed to the very first missionary that was sent. Barclay actually owned slaves. And so the Christian Missionary Society up in Indianapolis says, we don't want to send our money, we don't want to be associated with any group that would send a missionary who is a slave owner. And in fact, this group, the Christian Missionary Society, didn't get a lot of support because, again, a lot of people don't want to support any of these organizations. And now this is a rival one. And then, of course, what really sort of ended it was the Civil War came up, all the controversy, and soon we were embroiled in that, which would bring about an ending of slavery. So it kind of ended the rationale for this group. Now, there was also the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. And by 1875, they're doing work in England, Denmark, France, India, Turkey, Japan, and China. And, once you start making organizations, sometimes we call these parachurch organizations. Parachurch organizations. We still have plenty of them around today. The parachurch organizations. Today, if you think about any group, any organization that gets support from the local congregations and it does Christian work, we could call it a parachurch organization. Christian camps, different missions groups, Bible colleges and Christian colleges, orphanages, The list goes on and on. But one of the groups that's going to get involved, very involved, is going to be some of the ladies in the churches. And they organize themselves as the Christian Women's Board of Missions, the CWBM. This gets organized in 1874 out of Cincinnati. And these ladies work very hard, very accomplished at raising funds and promoting missions. That's what they're there to do, and they do a pretty good job of it through various fundraising events and so forth. They wanted to focus on both missions at home and abroad. They were also very interested in educational programs, say in the mountainous areas, and for African Americans who didn't have educational opportunities. And certainly, coming from the South, many had moved from the South where they had not been allowed to learn how to read or to have an education. And if you think about the mountainous areas, for example, I lived in Kentucky for a long time, eastern Kentucky, pretty hilly, pretty mountainous there, and not a lot of schools or education there. And they also tended to have feuds where people would fight. You probably have heard of the Hatfield and McCoy feuds between Kentucky and West Virginia, but also the Tolliver feuds and others in Kentucky where a lot of people were gunned down, killed. And the ladies believed that if these mountain people, who are usually pretty independent and somewhat rebellious and even occasionally violent, if they could get a good education, then it would calm them down and make them more, I guess what we might call civilized, and also, of course, be able to teach them about the gospel itself. So we'll see that mission societies, such as the United Christian Missionary Society, the UCMS, which gets organized in 1919 in St. Louis, will bring together a lot of these other mission groups. And so it'll bring together the American Christian Missionary Society, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women's Mission Society, and so forth. And also, they'll begin the National Benevolent Association and the Board of Ministerial Relief. Now, those of you who are considering serving a church, well, I don't know. You should. I think I feel duty bound to encourage you. If that's what you're going to do, I think that's great. But one of the things you need to do is you need to make sure you're preparing yourself for a time when you are no longer able to do ministry. That is, when you get too old. Many congregations, I'm not saying all, but many congregations make no allowance. They make no donations. They make no provisions for a minister to have any kind of a retirement, any kind of thing to help take care of them when they get too old to work. Maybe their health fails and so forth. I can remember, I'm not going to say any names, but I can remember, for example, a certain professor who was a long-time professor and very well known. I would eat lunch with him quite often in a college cafeteria. And I can remember the school had a policy at that time that all faculty got a free lunch because they wanted to encourage the professors to eat with the students, get to know the students, have interaction with them at lunch. And they had made a decision that they were no longer going to pay, or maybe we should say not charge, the faculty for lunch. And that had come up in a meeting, and I mentioned it to this retired professor. And he always came and ate lunch, and basically the school kind of covered his lunch. So he would come, he would get his lunch. He would actually take one of those little boxes with him with some food, take it back to his wife, who was not of good health, and she would eat there too. So this, I found out, was their main meal of the day, was lunch. And when I told him that they had recently said the faculty would no longer get a free lunch, he was visibly shocked. I mean, he was concerned. And he said to me, I don't know what I'm going to do if I don't get this lunch. And my wife gets to sort of, they let me take a box and I take some stuff back for my wife. I don't know what we'll do without this free lunch. And so that really hit home to me that professors, ministers, and others, the institutions for which we work, like colleges and Christian camps and churches and so forth, and even missionary societies, there are normally, I won't say always, but normally very little, if any, provision for that minister's retirement or to help that minister if they are stricken with illness and can no longer do their ministerial duties or teaching duties or whatever it might be. Now, by the way, just so you're not left hanging, the school extended to that retired professor free lunch to continue. That was averted at that time. Not for the rest of us, but definitely for him. So this is just an encouragement. This is just a word of wisdom that if you're going into ministry, you need to normally take control of your own retirement kind of plan, because there's not an overarching one in the Christian churches, churches of Christ. You're going to have to do it yourself. And you're typically not going to get extra money. Now, large churches, perhaps that's the case. But I've only worked at small churches, and I've worked at several Christian colleges, campus ministries, and other groups where there's absolutely no provision at all for retirement. So you have to do it yourself. It's self-funded. Now they will say, oh, here's something you can contribute to. But often the school, the church, the organization does not. All right? So that's just meant to be a word of, I guess I'd say warning, or a word of encouragement to think about that. You may think, well, I'm a long ways from needing that. But those years go by, and if you spent your life serving the church in various capacities, you may find yourself, as you approach your later years, with some real trouble there. Well, let's move on. There were a lot of criticisms of the United Christian Missionary Society. Some believe that the agencies, that is, those running this, were all liberals, liberal theologically and so forth. Some said the missionaries were practicing, that those that were sent were going out in the mission field and practicing open membership. Now, we've mentioned open membership before, but I'll mention it here again. Open membership is the practice of basically accepting anyone to join your congregation. In other words, let's say on a Sunday or whatever, somebody comes, they say, hey, I want to join your group. What do you do? Do you say, oh, okay, have you been baptized? How were you baptized? Why were you baptized? When were you baptized? What do you believe about Christ? And so forth. Are you going to ask a lot of questions? Or are you just going to say, oh, you were a member of the church down the road or in another city. Okay, you're a member here now too. So open membership would just say, you just say you're a member somewhere. Okay, we accept that. Now you're a member here. Some say that this was a precursor to starting a denomination. And of course, those were fighting words for many because we've been fiercely independent. Now, eventually, this will lead to what is called the International Convention of Christian Churches. This, at the annual meeting of the Christian Missionary Society, they will start to have, and this would sort of double as an unofficial general convention of all the churches, because they had representatives there from all the different states, many different congregations, and so forth. This began in 1856. And of course, they start bringing up topics there. Several controversial issues were brought up there, where they're sort of trying to make decisions for all the congregations at this meeting. That didn't sit too well with a lot of people. And one of the most controversial things they brought up was the Louisville Plan. Yes, I said Louisville, because I lived in Kentucky long enough that I was berated for saying it any other way, and I'm sure they would say even the way I just said it wasn't right. At any rate, this was an attempt to organize the churches in the Louisville Plan of 1869. So let's take a look at that. Basically what this plan would say, and by the way, I send you greetings from Louisville, each congregation would send money. They would send offerings to their district meeting. The district meeting would then, the district would then take this money, keep half of it. So let's say, and maybe you're not accustomed to this, I know at churches where I have been members and served and so forth, we never did this. You took up the offering, the local congregation controls that. They would decide where to send it, to a missionary or to a college or whatever. But what this was is you would send a portion of your offering. Let's say 10%, maybe 20%. You send it to the district. So let's say you collected $1,000 on a Sunday morning. Well, let's say it's 10%. Keep it easy. So you send $100 to the district. The district receives your $100 from Church X. Okay? From that $100, they're going to keep half. They're going to keep 50. What are they going to do with the other 50? They're going to send 50 of it to the state organization. And what's the state organization going to do? They're going to keep half. They get 25. Then they're going to send the last half, $25, to the national organization. So you see how the structure works. The local church, say, gets 80, 90%. The district gets, let's say, 10 or 20%, of which they give up half. So let's say if it was 20, they get 10%, then 5, then 5. So you see how that works. The national organization then would have 2 representatives from each state. Each state, there would be a state delegate or state representative. And from that then, they would send one representative. They could send one representative for each 5,000 members in that state. So if it was a state like Indiana, there were a lot of congregations there, or Kentucky, or Ohio, you'd have a lot. But if it was one where they didn't have as many, like, say, Iowa or someplace like that, they wouldn't get to send as many representatives. So the representatives are somewhat proportional, but also geographically spread out. Okay? So you start to see this organization can get pretty complicated here. And it's involving money. Once you involve money in things, then people start to change their attitude about it. Well, in 1869 then, there were attempts to reorganize all of this in Louisville, Kentucky. As we said, the Louisville Plan. Delegates are elected from the local congregations. They're going to serve in district meetings. From the district, the district will be sent to the state, and from the state, they'll be sent to the national office. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Once we have the money sent, and you get it up to, say, the national level, when the district keeps half, the state keeps half, that means there's not that much money sent to the national level. Most of the money at the national level actually gets consumed by the salaries of those at the national level. And so within a few years, the Louisville Plan is considered to be a failure because it simply did not, it consumed quite a bit of the money that it actually raised. Well, there were further mission organizations along the way. What were they? The Christian Women's Board of Missions, the CWBM, 1874. 1875, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. These, as we've already mentioned, along with the American Christian Missionary Society, will unite in 1919 as the United Christian Missionaries Society. Okay? So, you see, once these organizations begin, they proliferate, they multiply, and of course, some of the people's fears that the local congregation would begin to lose control or lose control even of their own money and what's going on will eventually be realized, I think. Well, that's one issue, our organizations, especially for missions and publishing and that sort of thing. But there's another large controversy of this time that we need to mention. And this is one that's about instrumental music. Instrumental music. There's an early controversy over music. What you have to remember, as we've mentioned elsewhere, is that these churches were, for the most part, not using any instruments in worship. You might think that very strange, right? You've never heard of such a thing, or you've not experienced such a thing, but it was the common thing in these early Restoration Movement churches to not have any instruments of any kind. You would just sing. How would you make the music? You would sing. You would have harmony with the songs and that sort of thing. In fact, many of those who still do not use instruments in their worship basically say that those who do often end up not singing, not really singing, and not really learning the songs and harmonizing, do all those things, that they just kind of are quiet. They don't say much. They don't sing out much. They just let the instruments sort of cover for all of that. And in some cases, I think they've got a point there. A lot of times I look around on Sunday mornings at the various churches where I am, and I don't see a lot of people strongly participating. Well, anyway, Alexander Campbell was opposed to instruments. Does that surprise you? Well, I don't know. He expressed his opposition in the Millennial Harbinger to instrumental music, here abbreviated IM, just to make it shorter. Instrumental music, he's opposed to it. He mentions it in October of 1851. He says, I think with Mr. G that instrumental music would be not only a desideratum, but an essential prerequisite to fire up the souls to even animal devotion. But I presume to all spiritually minded Christians, such aids would be as a cowbell in a concert. He's saying, some people say, we got to have this. We got to fire the people up. We got to need it. It's a great aid to worship. And he says, well, this is just like going to in an orchestra and just start ringing a cowbell. This just detracts. It does not help. That was his view. Now, this is all going to really come to a public. I mean, it's not. Occasionally, it's happening in different congregations, but the first really famous place where this takes place is in Midway, Kentucky, where this man right here, L.L. Pinkerton, Dr. L.L. Pinkerton, serves as minister. And L.L. Pinkerton was a medical doctor, very interesting guy. His background. He's often called the very first liberal of the Restoration Movement. By the way, I wrote an article in the Stone Campbell Encyclopedia a few years back, which I have made a copy of, and I've attached it to the class materials if you'd like to look up about L.L. Pinkerton. And here is the grave. I've taken many students to his grave. and explained his life there. But L.L. Pinkerton, we're just going to try to focus on this one thing of his life, and that's the use of music. But he found himself at odds, because he ended up, he was a medical doctor. He gave up his medical practice to be a preacher. And when the Civil War came, he was opposed to slavery. And even though he's living in Kentucky, he joined the Union Army as a doctor. And this did not make him any friends, or maybe I should say, did not make him many friends in Kentucky. They saw him as a kind of a traitor, a sellout, that sort of thing. But even before that happens, in 1859, the issue of music comes up. Now, by the way, L.L. Pinkerton also said he was preaching one day, and he looked down and he saw two orphan girls sitting in the pew. He had not seen them before, and he went and asked about them. They said, "These are orphan girls." And so he inquired, what's going to happen to them? Well, their parents died in a fire, and we're just keeping them for now. There weren't orphanages and things like that. He creates a school and an orphanage. This school is for females. It's called the Midway Female Orphanage School, because he had a heart for these orphaned girls, and girls were much more vulnerable than boys, had a harder time making money, especially if they didn't have a family. So this school took them in, gave them a place to live, gave them food to eat, and gave them training, so that when they ended, then many of them became school teachers. So he, while he may have been the first liberal, he is certainly a man with a heart for the lost and those who need help. Well, another thing that happens here is that he introduces the use of music, instruments. This instrument right here in particular, if you go to Midway, by the way, the female orphanage school has become later a college, and is now known as Midway College in Midway, Kentucky. There at the school, you can find this instrument. It's called a melodeon, has pedals down below, and you kind of pump it with your feet, and you play it there like a piano. As the story goes, evidently the people at his congregation couldn't sing very well, had a hard time. So they started to have practice on Saturdays to practice the songs they were going to sing on Sunday. And even with that, they didn't do that well. And so finally, one of the ladies that was there, she said, at home I have a melodeon, and if we brought it here to the church, we could use it when we practice, and it might help us learn the notes and that sort of thing. And so that's what they did. But then it didn't take very long after that, and somebody said, well, why don't we just play the melodeon while we're singing on Sundays? And that takes place about 1859. Okay? So therefore, and L.L. Pinkerton did not hide this. He publicized it. I think he was kind of a guy who did not shy away from controversy. Let's put it that way. Okay, so this is the incident, as it comes to be called, at Midway, 1859. Now, there are many who oppose the use of instruments. One of them is this man here, Benjamin Franklin, 1812 to 1878. Now, Benjamin Franklin is not the Benjamin Franklin perhaps you're thinking of, the colonial inventor from Philadelphia, but he was in fact the great nephew. That is, the other Benjamin Franklin was his great uncle. Anyway, he eventually becomes a minister, this Benjamin Franklin, and he begins a journal called the American Christian Review, which becomes to be a very important journal. A lot of people read it. It has a lot of importance. He addresses this idea of instrumental music in 1860, where he states something very strongly here. He says those who use instrumental music in worship never had or had lost the Spirit of Christ. Now that's a pretty harsh claim, I think. He's saying these people are really not Christians if they use instruments in their worship. He will repeat similar kinds of things in February 28th in another sort of article. Well, let's move on now. This controversy over music is going to continue. And eventually there'll be sort of three groups where some of these items get put together. In other words, people believe if you use instrumental music that basically you're theologically liberal, and then it also begins to bring in, say, open membership, instrumental music, missionary societies. These things get listed as things that liberals do, and but there could be multiple positions on this. So there's at least three main ones. There are some who support the missionary society and instrumental music, and those people they prompted the founding of the Christian Standard, a journal, magazine, in 1866. Isaac Arrett in Cincinnati, Ohio. These are people that support the use of instrumental music and the missionary society. Okay? Then there is another group. They support the missionary society, but they are opposed to instrumental music. This would be people like J.W. McGarvey and Moses Lard, both of whom are down teaching in Lexington, Kentucky. And then there are some who support neither. They support neither the missionary society nor instrumental music. People like Tolbert Fanning and David Lipscomb down around Nashville. And of course, David Lipscomb has his famous journal, The Gospel Advocate. Benjamin Franklin falls into this camp with his American Christian Review, and he ends up being centered in Indiana, at Anderson, Indiana. Well, let's think about this for a second. In March of 1864, Moses Lard will write this in his quarterly. Now, in the light of the foregoing principles, what defense can be urged for the introduction into some of our congregations of instrumental music? The answer, which thunders into my ear from every page of the New Testament, is none. Did Christ ever appoint it? Did the apostles ever sanction it? Or did any one of the primitive churches ever use it? Never. In what light then must we view him who attempts to introduce it into the churches of Christ of the present day? I answer, as an insulter of the authority of Christ. So those who do this, you see, are insulting Christ's authority, and as a defiant and impious innovation on the simplicity and purity of ancient worship. In no other light can we view him. In no other light should he be viewed. That is, those who are going to use instrumental music. But we are told that there is no harm in instrumental music, and that therefore it may be innocently introduced into the churches of Christ. I shall certainly attempt no grave reply to this shallow thing. For argument, I will not call it. Well, anyway, obviously, you can see he's opposed. Okay? And he's strongly opposed. So, J.W. McGarvey, quite famous, quite conservative, he is also opposed. What does he say in 1881 in Apostolic Times, a journal, a book, really, that he wrote? President John W. McGarvey, distinguished preacher, educator, who is engaged in the systematic teaching of the Bible for more than half a century, now president of the College of the Bible, Lexington, Kentucky, has taken a prominent and important part in the discussions of the question, and we select from his writings the following passage. Okay, so here we go. Here's what J.W. McGarvey wrote. It is manifest that we cannot adopt the practice without abandoning the obvious and only ground on which restoration of primitive Christianity can be accomplished, or on which the plea for it can be maintained. Such is my profound conviction, and consequently the question with me is not one concerning the choice or rejection of an expedient, but the maintenance or abandonment of a fundamental and necessary principle. And now he puts these marks to really hold this up as his main statement. I hold that the use of the instrument is sinful, and I must not be requested to keep my mouth shut in the presence of sin, whether committed by a church or an individual. The party which forces an organ into the church against the conscious protest of a minority and disorderly and schismatic, and not only because it stirs up strife, but because it causes it, because it is for the sake of a sinful innovation upon the divinely authorized worship of the church, and inasmuch as persons will carry this out. Well, anyway, this goes on, but I think you get the idea. He's opposed. He says right here, it is sinful. It is sinful. J.W. McGarvey, very well known in Lexington, Kentucky. Well, just how prevalent was it, this use of the instruments? Benjamin Franklin obviously opposed to it. What does he write? In 1868, he estimated that there were 10,000 congregations within the Restoration movement at that time, and not over 50 of them had used an instrument in worship. Okay, so not a wide practice. David Lipscomb, also opposed to it, wrote, those who introduce instrumental music give up the heart worship of Christ for the formalism of Judaism. So we see a real polarization here between those who advocate the use of instruments and those who are very much opposed to it. Well, at this time, the Civil War is going to break out. This is going to distract, I guess we might say. It's going to consume the energy of many. And of course, at this time, the faith of many is also going to be eroded. Why? Because of all the conflict, the death, because they have to go off and fight, shooting maybe their cousins, even their brothers at times. It's a terrible, terrible war. And even many will enlist, and preachers will also, and they become chaplains in the army. With this, many of these journals cease their publications, like the Gospel Advocate and many others. Some of them will be taken back up after the war. And in October of 1861, the Missionary Society condemned the South. And this, of course, upset many of the churches in the South. So we see that the Missionary Society decides they need to make a statement. And they do. And this actually creates more tension. Well, after the Civil War, what's going to happen? Many take up these issues that were started before, but we're now getting into what I would call the second generation, fully the second generation. Barton W. Stone had died earlier, but Alexander Campbell is going to die in 1866. We see that this happened with Walter Scott as well. And so we're really getting into what we might call the second generation fully of the Restoration movement. And so this issue of instruments, this issue of missionary societies, the issue of liberalism and that sort of thing, of theological liberalism, this is all going to continue on at this time. Well, Campbell dies in 1866. The Gospel Advocate, David Lipscomb, will restart in 1866, and we'll see David Lipscomb and Tolbert Fanning as editors of that. Over the next 40 years, the society, that is the missionary society, and the use of the instrument continue to be a barrier to unity and creating division. And so then, in 1906, the U.S. Census lists the Church of Christ and the Christian Church as different entities. So the Churches of Christ as one, that's the non-instrumental, don't use instruments. The Christian Church, sometimes disciples of Christ, using the instruments, they are separated in this official government document. So again, the division is not from any church organization. This is just recognizing that these people have separated over these issues and are not really working together, and so even the U.S. government begins to separate them. Now, another big issue that we have to cover here, in just a couple of slides before we end, is theological liberalism. So with the use of instrument and with the missionary societies and organization, another big issue, and they're all kind of tied together in some ways, is theological liberalism. L.L. Pinkerton, who we mentioned earlier, starts a journal called the Christian Monthly. And in his preaching and in his writing, he rejects the plenary, verbal inspiration of the Bible. What do we mean by that? Well, plenary, it's not a word maybe you use every day. It means complete. That the Bible is verbally inspired completely. He rejects that. He makes it clear in his writings and his preaching and so forth. Dr. R.C. Cave of St. Louis, in a sermon, rejects both the virgin birth and the bodily resurrection of Christ. Amazing. This is the effects of theological liberalism, which began in Europe, mostly in Germany, which made its way to the United States, into colleges, universities, and seminaries, and then from there the training of ministers who would then bring it to the pulpits and to the congregations themselves. And in 1889 also, J.S. Lamar accepted the unimmersed into fellowship of the church. So these issues, open membership, theological liberalism, instrumental music, different kinds of society, missionary societies and other societies, these were all issues that they were driving a wedge, although not officially, but sort of unofficially. If you went into a church and they started using an instrument, it's very clear to see what they thought about it. If you went into a church and there were no instruments. So this became to be a visual kind of thing that lets you see how they are interpreting a hermeneutical principle that if it's silent, silence means prohibition. Well, anyway, the Firm Foundation, this was another journal. You can see a cover of one here, the top of one, and then the pictures of those there. Austin McGarry, interesting character, who in his early life got into gunfights. He's down in Texas, and later becomes a sheriff and so forth. But he, when he becomes a preacher, he begins this journal, the Firm Foundation, and he attacks the prevalence of accepting the immersed for any cause and from denominations in the church. So this even then separates him from David Lipscomb. David Lipscomb basically said, well, if somebody's immersed, maybe they didn't fully understand that it was for the remission of sins, we can still accept them into the church. Austin McGarry said no, they have to completely understand what's happening and agree, or we got to do it again, I guess. They have to resubmit the baptism. In his first issue, he attacked the writings of T.R. Burnett, J.T. Poe, and eventually David Lipscomb and the Gospel Advocate. Well, we start to see the struggles that come with these issues. We've already seen it, haven't we? But we're going to unfortunately see more. It's going to lead to separation. It's going to lead to very emotional views that are bringing sadness to people because they're seeing these divisions. It's going to make some very angry. It's going to bring about strife and alienation between people and congregations and so forth. It's going to lead to divisions of various kinds. And ultimately, and sadly, it will mean lost opportunity as people are fighting over all this. The lost are sort of being forgotten in this. And it's going to end up taking up a lot of time, money, and strength. It will then yield feuds, heartbreak, heartburning about people. And so it's a sad commentary, but I think you can see how divisive these issues were. And that's really what led to the division between those who would use instruments and those who would not. So we also see the growth of organization continues, and it'll eventually result in the beginning of a denomination with the disciples of Christ. And this means that we have the sort of separation between those who use instruments and those who don't. But then those that do use instruments, there's still this theological divide between them. And those who really want to seek more and more organization. And so the General Convention of the Churches of Christ in Louisville in 1912 will eventually, it'll become called that, and then it's revised and renamed the International Convention of the Disciples of Christ in 1917 in Kansas City. And then ultimately, we're going to see that it's going to become the International Convention of the Christian Churches, Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ. And they're going to form a denomination at about this time. The denomination then, it's basically going to say that any congregation that is called Christian Church belongs to this denomination. And that means that the building and all the assets in the building, any of the money that's in the bank, all that belongs to the denomination. This will be taken all the way to the Supreme Court of Indiana. And there's a lot of harsh words, a lot of fighting here, where basically they want to say that, your building belongs to us, your whatever's in the building belongs to us, your money you might have in a bank account belongs to us, and if you don't like that, then you go off and start your own congregation from scratch. And this is why it went to the courts, actually. And finally, the Supreme Court, it made it all the way to the Supreme Court of Indiana, where they decided that each congregation could take a vote and decide if they wanted to join this denomination. And that's what saved many congregations from being absorbed into the denomination. But basically, all the colleges were absorbed by the disciples of Christ, except for these Bible colleges that we mentioned elsewhere. Well, I hope this discussion, a little lengthy, I guess, but I hope it helps you understand a little more about what happens in the 20th century and those things that lead on to us in the 21st century. So, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you later then. Take care.